My name is Aaron, and at 34 I believed I had finally built something no one could take from me. A steady marriage, a small house on the quiet edge of town, and a husband named Daniel who still reached for my hand in his sleep. I want to start with the night everything became clear, because I think the truth always arrives in a single, ordinary moment. We were at his mother's table, surrounded by family candlelight, the warm clatter of dishes. Patricia leaned toward me while everyone laughed at something Daniel said. And under that laughter, where no one else could hear, she told me softly that I would never really belong here. She said it the way you'd comment on the weather. Then she straightened, smiled at the table, and asked who wanted more wine. I kept smiling too. But in that half-second I understood something I had been refusing to see for months. This woman wasn't simply cold toward me. She had a plan. And the plan was to make me disappear from my own marriage. Let me back up, because none of this happened all at once. Daniel and I had been married 4 years. He was kind in the steady, unremarkable ways that matter most. The man who warmed the car before I left for work, who remembered the names of my co-workers, who never once made me feel small. I loved him without drama. The way you love a home you've finally settled into. His mother, Patricia, was another story. In public she was gracious, generous, the kind of woman people called lovely, without ever really knowing her. In private, every kindness came with a hook. A compliment about my cooking that somehow reminded everyone I'd grown up with less. A gift, given loudly, that quietly suggested Daniel and I couldn't manage on our own. I told myself it was just her way. I told myself a lot of things back then. Before I go further, I want to pause for a second, because if you're listening to this, I have a feeling you already know exactly the kind of person I'm describing. Maybe you've sat at a table like that, smiling while someone chipped away at you under their breath. If you have, I'd really love for you to tell me about it in the comments, where you're listening from, and whether you've ever had to hold your composure while someone tried to make you feel like a guest in your own life. It honestly helps me to know I'm not telling these stories into the dark. And if these kinds of stories stay with you, take a second to subscribe, so we can keep walking through them together. Now back to that table, and back to the moment things first started to crack. The first real sign came at a birthday dinner, months before that whispered remark. Patricia was telling a story about young couples today living beyond their means. And then, smiling sweetly, she mentioned a private money worry I had once confided to her alone, laid it right out in front of the whole family, dressed up as concern. Everyone chuckled. Daniel laughed it off. But I watched her face as the laughter rose, and I saw it. The small, satisfied stillness of someone who had aimed and hit exactly what she meant to hit. It wasn't a slip. It was a shot. I didn't make a scene. I've learned that a woman who reacts loudly is the easiest woman to dismiss. And something told me that dismissing me was precisely what she wanted. So I did the only thing I could do that night. I stayed calm. I refilled my glass, I complimented the cake, and I started, almost without deciding to, paying very close attention. And once I started paying attention, I couldn't stop seeing the pattern. Every helpful comment left me a little smaller in front of the family. Every generous gesture left Daniel a little more indebted to his mother, and a little more inclined to keep the peace. The relatives who once greeted me warmly began to feel just slightly cooler, just slightly more careful around me. And I couldn't yet name why. Looking back now, I can see how the threads connected, each one pulled with patience, each one tightening. At the time, I only knew that the ground beneath my marriage had begun to shift, quietly, like sand moving under still water. That night after the birthday dinner, I lay awake long after Daniel had fallen asleep, his hand resting over mine the way it always did. And I made myself a quiet promise in the dark. I would stop explaining away the things my instincts already knew. I would stop calling cruelty an accident. Whatever Patricia was building, I was going to watch it carefully, completely, and without flinching, because I had finally understood that the woman smiling across the table from me was not on my side, and she never had been. What I didn't know yet was how far she was willing to go. The next move came wrapped in ribbon. For our anniversary, Patricia gave us something far too generous, a lavish gift, presented at a full family gathering, the kind of thing you can't refuse without looking ungrateful. She made sure everyone saw it. And then later, in the quiet of her kitchen, she framed it differently just for me. A gentle reminder that Daniel and I would always need her, that without her steadying hand our little life might not hold together. I understood then that her generosity was never a gift at all. It was a leash, and she was teaching my husband to feel the weight of it. I thanked her warmly because that is what you do. But I'd begun to see the shape of the thing clearly now. She wasn't trying to be part of our marriage. She was trying to own the part of it that mattered most, Daniel's sense of who he owed. Not long after, the air around me started to change. Relatives who had always been warm became careful. Conversations dipped when I entered rooms. A cousin who used to text me funny things went quiet. It took me weeks to understand why, and when I did, it landed like cold water. Patricia had been telling people, gently, sorrowfully, always in confidence, that Daniel and I were struggling, that I had grown distant, that she worried about her son. The story was vague enough that no one could question it, and specific enough that everyone believed it. I had never had to defend my own reputation inside my own family before. Now I could feel it slipping out of my hands, rewritten by someone who smiled while she held the pen. Then came the line I will never forget. We were clearing plates after a Sunday dinner when Patricia said lightly, almost playfully, that she'd heard I'd been seen, looking awfully close with a man from my office, a colleague named Marcus, a married co-worker I'd barely thought twice about. She said it with a little laugh, the way you'd tease someone. But I wasn't watching her. I was watching Daniel. And for half a second, just half a second, I saw something flicker behind his eyes before he shook his head and laughed it off. That flicker frightened me more than the accusation itself. Because in that instant I understood what she was really doing. She wasn't insulting me. She was planting a seed. And she had just found the soil she'd been looking for. Every part of me wanted to confront her right there. I wanted to set down the plates, look her in the eye, and ask her in front of everyone what exactly she thought she was doing to my marriage. But I didn't. Because I finally understood the trap. A furious wife is the easiest woman in the world to dismiss. The unstable one, the dramatic one, the one who proves the story being told about her. That was precisely what Patricia wanted. For me to hand her the evidence she didn't yet have. So I made a different choice, and it was the hardest kind of choice there is, the quiet one. I decided I would not give her my anger. I would give her my attention instead. I started keeping track of the strange moments. The comments that didn't add up, the concerns that always seemed timed, the gifts that always came with strings. I wrote down dates. I saved messages. I noticed things and said nothing. It felt unnatural at first, swallowing reactions I had every right to have. But I told myself that composure was not weakness. It was strategy. A woman who keeps her head while someone tries to take everything from her is not surrendering. She is preparing. What I didn't yet know was how thoroughly she had already prepared. Or how much of what was coming had nothing to do with whispers at all. And everything to do with money. Because while I was learning to watch her words, Patricia had already moved past words. She had moved to paperwork. And the first time I saw what she was quietly building behind all that family money, I realized this was never going to be a fight about a rumor. It was going to be a fight about my whole future. To understand what came next, you have to understand the money. Because in Daniel's family, the money was never just money. It was control with a polite face. Daniel co-ran the family business his father had built before he passed, and Patricia still held a hand on the wheel. A partial stake, a vote, a presence in every important decision. Much of what Daniel and I called our security was tangled up in that arrangement. The business, a shared interest in the house, the accounts that kept everything running. For years it had felt like support, like family taking care of family. But now, watching Patricia move, I finally saw it for what it was. Every time she frowned, Daniel flinched. Every time she sighed about what's best for the family, he reconsidered. The leash I'd sensed in her gifts had always been financial. She didn't just want to influence my husband. She had spent years making sure he could never fully step away from her without losing the ground beneath his feet. Then she made her cleverest move yet, and she dressed it as prudence. One evening she arrived with a folder and a soft, reasonable smile, and suggested that Daniel and I sign a post-nuptial agreement. Just to protect the family business, she said, the way any sensible family would. She spoke about responsibility, about legacy, about protecting what Daniel's father had built. It sounded careful. It sounded loving. But I read it the way you read a contract written by someone who needs you to feel safe. Buried in that protection was a quiet erasure. Terms designed to strip me of any real claim if the marriage ended. And that was the detail that made my blood run cold. You don't prepare paperwork for a divorce that isn't happening. Unless, of course, you fully intend to cause one. After that night, I started paying attention to the money the way she'd taught me to pay attention to her words. And not long after, the numbers told me something her smile never would. A statement arrived that wasn't meant for my eyes. Or maybe I overheard a call I wasn't supposed to hear. And I saw it. Money moving. Funds being quietly repositioned. Some shifting in ways that didn't match anything Daniel had mentioned. I couldn't yet prove what it was for. But I knew enough to know it wasn't innocent. So I did what I had trained myself to do. I didn't gasp, I didn't ask, I didn't tip my hand. I photographed what I could. I saved what I found. I built a quiet record, page by page, and I kept it somewhere only I could reach. It is a lonely thing, carrying a suspicion you can't say out loud. There were nights I sat across from Daniel at dinner, and wondered if I was losing my mind. If I was the paranoid wife his mother kept describing to everyone. That doubt is its own kind of poison, and I think Patricia counted on it. And then when I needed it most, a hand reached out from the most unexpected place. It was Carol, Daniel's aunt, Patricia's own sister. Carol had spent years on the edges of family gatherings, polite but distant, quietly disliked by Patricia for reasons no one ever explained. One afternoon, as we washed dishes side by side, she said something I will never forget. She told me, gently, without quite spelling it out, that she had seen this before. That I wasn't imagining things. That her sister had a way of removing people who didn't bend to her, and that she'd watched it happen once already long ago. She didn't give me the whole story that day. But she gave me something I'd been starving for. The certainty that I wasn't crazy, and the knowledge that I wasn't alone. I held on to Carol after that. Not as a weapon, not yet, but as proof to myself that my own eyes could be trusted. Between the documents I was quietly collecting and the steadiness Carol offered, I felt for the first time like I might actually be able to stand against what was coming. I had no idea, in that warm kitchen with my hands in the soapy water, that the cruelest blow had not even fallen yet. It was already being arranged. And it would arrive in an envelope. The envelope came on a Sunday, and Patricia made sure the whole family was there to see it. We were gathered in her living room when she set it on the coffee table with the gravity of a woman doing something painful, but necessary. Inside were photographs of me with Marcus, the married colleague she'd mentioned weeks earlier. Except these weren't the harmless reality of two co-workers crossing a parking lot. They were angled, cropped, and timed to suggest something intimate that had never, ever happened. A hand caught mid-gesture made to look like a touch. A shared laugh framed to look like a secret. She presented them softly, as a heartbroken mother forced to protect her son from a wife who was betraying him. And as I stared down at a perfectly ordinary afternoon twisted into evidence of an affair, I felt the floor disappear from under me. The room went silent. Every eye turned to Daniel. And here is the moment I have replayed more times than I can count. The half-second that nearly ended us. Daniel looked at the photographs, and then he looked at me. And for one terrible instant I saw doubt cross his face. Just a flicker. The same flicker I'd caught weeks before, only deeper now, because his mother had finally given that seed something to grow on. Every part of me wanted to fall apart, to cry, to beg him to believe me. But I knew, that pleading would look exactly like guilt. So I did the hardest thing I have ever done. I held his gaze, and I said quietly and only once, that none of it was true. Then I picked up my coat, and I walked out with my head level, even as I felt my marriage cracking straight down the middle behind me. That night was the lowest of my life. I sat alone in our dark kitchen, the silence so complete I could hear my own heartbeat, and I let myself feel all of it. The humiliation, the betrayal, the fear that the man I loved might choose his mother's lie over my truth. I cried, but only for a while. Because somewhere in that long, awful night, the grief began to harden into something else. Something colder and far more useful. I started to think. Staged photographs, I realized, don't appear out of nothing. Someone had to take them. Someone had to be positioned, paid, instructed. A lie that elaborate has moving parts, and moving parts leave marks. The very thoroughness of the frame-up, the thing that made it so devastating, was also its weakness. Patricia had built something complicated, and complicated things always cost money, and money always leaves a trail. For the first time since the envelope hit that table, I felt the smallest flicker of power return to me. She had made a mistake. She had given me something to follow. The next morning I stopped being a woman who had been wronged and became a woman with a plan. I spread the photographs out on the table. Forced myself to really look at them, not as accusations but as clues. And almost immediately something caught my eye. A detail. A reflection in a window that didn't match where I was supposed to have been. A sliver of background, a timestamp that didn't line up with the story being told about it. Small things. But small things, I was learning, are exactly where careful liars get careless. I called Carol. She came that afternoon. And when I showed her what I'd noticed, she didn't tell me I was reaching. She leaned in closer. Together we started tracing the photographs backward, where they might have been taken, when and by whom. Carol knew things about her sister that I didn't, patterns from years of watching Patricia operate, and she helped me see which threads were worth pulling. By the time she left that evening, the fear in my chest had been replaced by something steadier. The lie that was meant to erase me had just become the map I would use to find my way back. I didn't know yet whose name was at the end of that trail. I didn't know how much money had changed hands, or what else Patricia had been hiding behind all that careful paperwork. But I knew this much, with a calm that surprised even me. She had finally overreached. And I was going to follow every single thread until it led me straight to her. Finding the photographer was easier than I expected, because people who take stage photos for money still need to be paid like anyone else. The detail in the background, that sliver Carol and I had noticed, pointed to a specific spot, and from there the threads unspooled. A reflection, a particular angle, the kind of polished framing an amateur doesn't manage by accident. These weren't snapshots from a passing relative. They were shot by someone who did this for a living. With Carol's help and a few careful, ordinary inquiries, a mutual contact, a public listing, a name that kept surfacing, I found him. A local photographer named Greg, the kind who took on quiet private jobs and didn't ask many questions, and hired people leave invoices. Working slowly, lawfully, never tipping my hand, I traced the work he'd done back to a payment, and the payment hadn't come from a stranger. It had originated from Patricia's own funds. The fabrication that nearly cost me my marriage now had a name, a date, and a price tag. Then the numbers did the rest. I went back to the statements I'd been quietly saving for weeks, the strange transfers, the sums that hadn't matched anything Daniel mentioned, and I laid them beside what I'd just learned about Greg. And there it was. The payment to the photographer traced back to the very same account where money had been moving in the dark. Suddenly the scattered pieces snapped into one clear picture. The repositioned funds. The just-in-case post-nup. The smear campaign. They weren't separate worries at all. They were one coordinated plan, executed by one person, with her fingerprints on every step. Patricia had funded my destruction, and her own financial cushion in the same patient motion. For the first time, I wasn't holding a suspicion. I was holding proof. But proof of money is not the same as proof of intent, and I knew that. A clever woman like Patricia could explain away a transfer, blame a misunderstanding, paint herself as the victim of my paranoia. So I needed something she couldn't talk her way around. I needed her own voice. I won't pretend that part was comfortable. But there came an afternoon, just the two of us in her kitchen, where she always felt most untouchable, when Patricia grew careless. Confident she'd already won, she spoke freely. She let her satisfaction show. She said things about getting that woman out of her son's life, about how it was only a matter of time, about how she'd always known how this would end. And this time, I was ready. Within what I was lawfully permitted to do, I captured every word. I listened to it once later, alone in my car, my hands shaking on the wheel. Not from fear now, but from the strange, cold relief of finally having the truth in a form no one could deny. Documents could be argued. This could not. This was her, in her own voice, admitting exactly who she was. I had the money. I had the motive. What I didn't have yet was a clear understanding of what any of it meant legally. And that's where Carol changed everything one more time. She quietly connected me with a family attorney she trusted, a sharp, steady woman named Diane. I brought Diane everything. The stage photo trail, the payment to Greg, the moving funds, the recording. She went through all of it carefully, and then she told me something that shifted the ground beneath my feet. This time in my favor. The postnut Patricia had pushed so hard wasn't nearly the trap she'd made it sound. My standing was far stronger than Patricia had ever let anyone believe. The leverage the woman had wielded over this family for years was, in legal reality, nowhere near as absolute as her confidence suggested. I sat in Diane's office and felt something I hadn't felt in months. Not anger. Not fear. Steadiness. The balance of power in this family had already quietly shifted. Patricia just didn't know it yet. I had spent so long being the one things were done to. Now for the first time, I held the truth, the evidence, and the counsel to use it. There was only one piece left, and it was the one that mattered most. Daniel still didn't know any of this. And before I did anything else, I needed my husband to see, clearly, completely, and in his mother's own words, exactly what she had done. I didn't ambush him. After everything, Daniel deserved the truth the way I'd had to learn it, completely, and without theatrics. So one quiet evening, when the house was still and there was no one to perform for, I sat my husband down and laid it all out. Not with accusations, not with tears, but with evidence. I showed him the photographs and the detail that proved they were staged. I showed him the trail to Greg, the photographer his mother had paid. I showed him the money moving through her accounts, the postnup for what it really was. And then last, I let him hear the recording. I watched his face as his mother's voice filled the room. Calm and certain, talking about getting that woman out of his life. I didn't ask him to choose. I simply set the truth in front of him and let it speak for itself. It was the most honest and the most frightening moment of our entire marriage, because I knew that whatever he did next would tell me who I had really married. For a long time, Daniel didn't say anything at all. I watched the proof rearrange his whole life behind his eyes. Every guilt trip his mother had ever used. Every concern that had quietly undercut me. Every gift with a string. Every frown that had made him fold. Every time he'd kept the peace by asking me to be the one who bent. He saw it now, not as isolated moments, but as a pattern, a lifetime of control he'd mistaken for love. And then he saw the worst of it. The part one thing broke something open in him. That half-second of doubt at the coffee table. The flicker his mother had worked so patiently to create. He understood how close he had come to believing her. How close he had come to losing the one thing in his life that was actually real. The shame and the clarity hit him at the same time. And I watched both of them settle into something harder. Something like resolve. When he finally spoke, his voice was different than I'd ever heard it. He didn't apologize and leave it there. Though he did apologize fully, for that half-second I'll carry for a long time. He went further. He told me, plainly, that he was done. Done letting his mother hold our marriage hostage with money. Done flinching. He said he would protect me and protect us. And then, this is the part that mattered. He told me how. Not in feelings but in actions. He sat down with Diane himself. He laid out concrete steps. Restructuring his stake in the family business, so his mother no longer held it over us. Securing our shared assets, killing the postnup, and removing Patricia's control over the parts of our life she had used as a leash for years. For the first time in our marriage, I watched my husband choose me, not with a sentence but with something binding. I won't lie and say it healed everything instantly. There was grief in his face too, the particular grief of a son realizing what his mother truly was. But there was no more hesitation in him. The man who had frozen for half a second at that table was gone. And in his place was someone who had finally decided where he stood. Then we talked about the part neither of us relished. Because a private decision wasn't enough. Not after what Patricia had done in front of the whole family. She had poisoned my name at dinners and gatherings, in confidences and sympathetic whispers, and a quiet, behind closed doors resolution would leave that poison in the water forever. The record had to be corrected where it had been broken. In front of everyone. We chose an upcoming family gathering. Not to humiliate her for sport. I want to be clear about that, because I had no interest in becoming what she was. We would do it with facts, with calm, and with consequences already in place. I insisted on dignity over revenge. Daniel agreed. So we prepared. We organized the evidence, confirmed the steps with Diane, and decided exactly what would be said and how. And in the quiet days before that dinner, there was a strange, steadying calm in our house. The calm of two people who finally knew the truth, knew their footing, and knew what was coming. Everyone but Patricia could feel the reckoning approaching. She walked into that dinner believing she had already won. The dinner began exactly the way Patricia liked her dinners, with her at the center of it. She arrived radiant, gracious, holding court the way she always did, certain that this was the evening she would finally preside over my quiet exit from the family. She had spent months preparing the family for it, and now she moved through the room collecting the sympathy she'd planted. At one point she even aimed a barbed little remark in my direction. Something soft and smiling about how some marriages just aren't meant to last. And a few relatives glanced at me with that careful pity she'd taught them to feel. I absorbed it without flinching. I let her have her moment because I knew something she didn't, and so did Daniel. Everyone she'd manipulated was seated at the same table now, exactly where the truth could reach all of them at once. Her confidence filled the room. So did her ignorance. Then Daniel stood up. He didn't shout. He didn't pound the table. He simply asked for everyone's attention, and in a calm, steady voice he told the truth. He told them the photographs of me had been staged, and he explained how we knew. He told them about Greg, the photographer his mother had paid, and about the money she had quietly moved to fund all of it. He told them the rumors about my distance, the worried confidences she'd shared, the story of a struggling marriage. All of it had been built, deliberately, by one person. And then he named her. He looked at his mother and said, plainly, that she had done this. Around the table, I watched faces change. The relatives who had cooled toward me began to understand that they hadn't been let in on a secret. They'd been used. And Patricia's expression, that practiced mask of gracious sorrow, slowly cracked. The triumph drained out of her face and something else crept in. The dawning horror of a woman feeling a room turn against her for the first time in her life. But Daniel didn't stop at exposure, because words alone would have let her recover. He told the family what had already been done. With Diane's help, the decisions were finished, not pending. His mother had been removed from any control over our finances and our share of the family business. The post-nup she'd pushed so hard was dead. Our shared assets were secured, protected, in our hands. The leash she had held over Daniel, and through him, over this entire family, was cut. And the most fitting part, the part one thing she felt most keenly, was that she had done it to herself. The very scheme she built to erase me was the thing that exposed her and stripped away the control she had spent a lifetime guarding. She had reached for everything, and in reaching, lost the one thing she truly valued. Then Daniel looked at me, and he gave me the floor. I want you to know that I didn't gloat. I had imagined this moment more than once in those long, sleepless nights. And in some of those imaginings I'd pictured myself saying something cruel, something that would make her feel even a fraction of what she'd made me feel. But standing there, with the truth finally on my side and the whole family watching, I found I didn't want it. So I kept my voice even. I said simply what had been done to me. I said what I would no longer tolerate. And I set the boundary plainly. That I was Daniel's wife, that I was not going anywhere, and that the way this family had let itself be turned against me would not happen again. That was all. No screaming, no insults, no victory lap. And strangely, that composure did what no outburst ever could have. The room respected it. I could feel it. The shift, the quiet recognition that the woman they'd been taught to pity was the only one at that table who had handled all of this with grace. Patricia sat alone in the middle of the family she tried to weaponize, stripped of her mask and her leverage in the same evening, isolated by the very people she'd counted on. No one rushed to defend her. For the first time, there was nothing left for her to spin. The storm I had braced for had finally broken, and in its place, slowly, the air began to clear. The weeks after that dinner were quieter than any I'd known in a long time. The legal changes were finalized, signed, and real. Daniel's stake in the family business was restructured and protected. Our shared assets were secured. The post-nup was gone for good. And Patricia was held firmly and permanently, at a distance. No longer a presence in our finances, our decisions, or our daily peace. Some of the relatives who'd grown cold toward me came to me privately, awkward and apologetic, admitting they'd believed a story they never should have. I accepted their apologies without making them grovel. I had no appetite for that. And Carol, steady, quiet Carol, the one hand that had reached for me when I was drowning, became something more than an aunt-in-law. She became family in the truest sense, honored at last for the loyalty she'd shown when it cost her something to show it. Our marriage, tested in a fire I wouldn't wish on anyone, came out of it steadier and more honest than it had ever been. For the first time, it was fully ours. Daniel and I talked, really talked in those weeks. He owned that half-second of doubt without excuses. The flicker his mother had spent years cultivating. The moment that had nearly cost us everything. He didn't ask me to pretend it hadn't happened, and I didn't pretend. We spoke honestly about the years his mother's control had shaped him. About how a boy taught to fear his mother's disapproval grows into a man who flinches without knowing why. And we spoke about the boundaries that would keep our marriage safe from now on. Not walls built in anger, but lines drawn with clear eyes. It wasn't a fairy tale where the pain simply vanished. It was something better, I think, and harder. Two people choosing each other again on purpose, knowing exactly what they were choosing and what it had survived. I've thought a lot about what I learned through all of it, and I want to leave you with it, because if you've listened this far, I suspect some of this lives in your life too. I learned that the cruelest people are rarely the loudest. They smile. They give gifts. They speak in soft, sorrowful confidences while they quietly take everything from you. And I learned that you don't have to become like them to defeat them. I never raised my voice. I never staged a scene. I simply refused to be erased. I trusted my own eyes, I gathered the truth, and I waited for the right moment to let it speak. Composure outlasts manipulation. Proof outlasts gossip. And a love that's willing to stand its ground, even after it stumbles, is worth more than a love that was never tested at all. Patricia thought that blood would always beat marriage. She thought her son would always choose her. What she never understood is that loyalty isn't owed, it's earned, and it can be lost. In the end, she didn't lose me. She lost him. And she did it entirely by her own hand. So let me ask you before I go. Have you ever had someone try to write you out of your own life? Certain you'd just disappear quietly? I'd love to hear your story in the comments, wherever in the world you're listening from. Tell me how you held your ground, or how you wish you had. And if this story stayed with you, the way these stories stay with me, take a moment to subscribe so we can keep sitting together with truths like this one. Because I promise you this. You are never as alone as the people trying to erase you want you to believe. And the quiet ones, the ones who watch and wait, and refuse to break, we have a way of writing our own endings.